My name is Eden Medina. I am an associate professor of informatics and computing at Indiana University. I also direct the Rob Kling Center for Social Informatics at the same institution. My research and training spans electrical engineering, as well as the history and social study of technology, and more recently, law. I'm here at the IPSP as part of a cross-cutting group on science and technology. And the way that I understand it, this group was put together so that issues that pertain to science and technology will be integrated throughout the report instead of being shuffled off into an independent chapter. Science and Technology Studies is also known as STS, and it is a field that is interested in the production of scientific knowledge as well as in the production of technologies and technological systems. And it is very interested in the ways that history and society and culture shape the ways that we know the world around us, as well as the kinds of technologies that we produce. People from the field of science and technology studies use a range of methodologies from the social sciences and the humanities. So for example, they may use methods from history or anthropology or sociology. And they might use these methods to understand things such as how does a community understand the production of a scientific fact? At what point does it become a scientific fact? How do power relationships or ways of seeing the world affect technological design? Or ways of thinking about the relationship of science and technology to processes of science, processes of historical change. In my own research, I also span different disciplines and bring together engineering with history and also law. So I was really excited to be invited to participate in the IPSP. Part of my research has been dedicated to expanding the ways that we think about innovation and thinking about innovation in a more global way. So for example, my research has been looking at the history of computing technology in Latin America. And so while we might think of innovation, especially innovation of computer technologies, as something that occurs predominantly in the United States, that of course is not true. Innovation takes place all over the world, and different political and historical contexts give rise to different technological systems. And so and different ways of being, right? And I think it's important to understand those different ways of being and alternative ways of creating technologies. The IPSP has a global scope and is interested in how we can bring together different facets of social science research and research in the humanities to think about making the world a more socially just place. So that, of course, appealed to me greatly. I'm involved in a chapter on supranational organizations and global policy. My research, as I mentioned, focuses on computer technology and internet technology, which is a global communications infrastructure. So I think when we're thinking about a global communications infrastructure that has been recognized as being fundamental to the exercise of many rights, such as freedom of expression. Of course, there are issues that arise now around privacy and how we might regulate the internet in ways that would protect and uphold that fundamental right to privacy. And this it overlaps and intersects with forms of global governance and the roles that supranational organizations play. So I'm very excited to be part of a conversation that is thinking about this in ways that align with values of social justice and social progress. Thinking about what is one of the biggest problems or biggest challenges in my field, that's a tremendous question. Clearly, when you think about science and technology, there are a number of pressing problems that would overlap with the study of science and technology. Climate change being a major one, and the role of science and technology both as part of the problem and as part of a potential solution. My research, scholarship, and teaching is centered in a school of informatics and computing. So from my perspective, a pressing problem today is thinking about data privacy and the ways that we design and regulate and use new technologies in ways that can uphold that right or in ways that undermine that right. In the United States, oftentimes our data is shared and used and aggregated in ways that we are not aware of. So for example, if you were to go visit the New York Times website, you might be, oftentimes people think when they visit a website that their traffic is just going to that particular server. If you go to the New York Times, for example, you may have 28 third-party trackers following your browsing activity. You might have more, right? And none of that is visible to the lay user. In contrast, we see an alternative approach to these issues being advocated by the European Union, which to tie to my chapter theme of supranational organizations. And the European Union has framed data privacy as a fundamental right and has, created bodies of law around data privacy that are very different from those that are being advocated in the United States. And from my perspective as an STS scholar, STS scholars are very interested in how values or historical context or different geographies shape the form and function of our technological systems. So from an STS perspective, I see the debates that are growing up around data privacy as something that is very academically interesting. From an IPSP perspective, thinking about how we can create institutions or regulations that might bring broader participation to these kinds of issues, or that might advocate alternative ways of thinking about the problem or addressing this problem. I think that is also something that is very important. I see the IPSP as an opportunity to engage with scholars from many different disciplines who are thinking about related issues, but from very different angles. So for example, in my chapter, we have a number of human rights scholars. We have people who are very interested in international law, people who are interested in intellectual property, someone like me who's very interested in technology. And so we're all interested in thinking about the successes and pathologies of these kinds of institutions. And at bottom, ways of thinking about ways that we could improve them or perhaps draw from the existing literature and make it more accessible to improve the efficacy or inclusiveness of these organizations. One change that I would like to see in my field, so not as a social problem, but something more academic. Well, something that I've been working toward in my work, and that I think is happening, is a way to make the field of science and technology studies more inclusive globally. So the field's origins are quite Eurocentric or US-centric. So we have a lot of literature that studies laboratory practice, right? So how is the scientific fact generated in the context of a laboratory, which is a very particular way of gaining knowledge about the world. Or, for example, there are a lot of studies in the earlier days of the field that have been written about very successful technologies, right, or technologies that we might know about. So the light bulb, for example. You have these canonical stories of invention, and then of course critiques of those canonical stories of invention. But oftentimes these stories tend to come from very similar geographies. Something that I've been working towards is to try to diversify where we understand science and technology come from, thinking about alternative technological systems, but also broadening ways of knowing, so different ways of gaining knowledge about the world. It's tricky because, as many people who have also been engaged with this project have pointed out, if you use the tools of social science from the global north, in a way you're transposing these ways of seeing the world to explain phenomena in other parts of the world. So by its very definition, the project of using social science or fields like STS as a way to broaden geographies of innovation or scientific knowledge, or using the word science in itself could be considered flawed. So it's a tremendous challenge, and there's scholarship that is emerging now that is trying to use scholarship generated from other parts of the world as a way of understanding alternative forms of knowledge production and relationships to technology. And I hope that my work will continue to be part of that discussion. And one of the things that I found pleasantly surprising about my involvement with the IPSP is how committed people are to global inclusiveness. Not only in terms of representation, but also in terms of epistemology. And so I have found that to be a pleasant surprise and something that has been nice to see.